Picture a world without clocks, no buzzing alarms, no ticking hands, no digital screens flashing the hour. If you lived in a medieval city, how would you know when to rise for work, when the market gates swung open, or when it was time to gather for prayer? Time wasn't something you checked on a device. It was something you felt in the rhythm of the day, woven into the very fabric of life. The medieval world had no mechanical clocks, yet people didn't wander in confusion. Instead, they relied on ingenious, deeply human ways to mark the hours, methods that tied them to the sky, the seasons, and each other. Think about the last time you lost track of time, maybe while lost in a good book or a conversation with a friend. Now imagine that sense of timelessness stretched across entire cities, where the sun's arc and the sound of bells dictated the pace of life. Sundials cast shadows like silent messengers, while church towers rang out across cobblestone streets, dividing the day into sacred and ordinary moments. Water clocks dripped away the hours in monasteries, and candle clocks burned steadily through the night. These weren't just tools, they were reflections of a society that saw time as something alive, something shared. What's truly remarkable is how these methods didn't just tell time, they shaped it. The way a city kept time influenced when people worked, prayed, and celebrated, binding communities together under a collective rhythm. And here's the surprising part. Many of these systems were so effective that they lasted for centuries, long before gears and pendulums took over. So how did medieval cities pull this off? How did they turn sunlight, sound, and even fire into a kind of clock? That's the story we're about to unravel, a journey into an era where time wasn't measured in minutes, but in the rising of bread at the baker's oven, in the tolling of vespers, in the slow burn of a candle marking the night watch. By the end, you'll never look at your wristwatch the same way again. To understand how medieval cities kept time, we first need to step into their world, where hours weren't rigid slots on a schedule, but living, breathing moments tied to the earth itself. Imagine standing in a field at dawn, watching the mist rise as the sun's first light touches the cathedral spire. That's how the day began, not with an alarm, but with the sky itself dictating when to rise. Time wasn't something you owned or wasted. It was something you moved through, like seasons turning or crops growing. The rhythm of life followed the sun's journey, with laborers starting their tasks at first light and laying down tools when shadows grew long. Even the length of an hour wasn't fixed. Daylight hours stretched longer in summer, shorter in winter, because time bent to nature's will, not the other way around. At the heart of this system was the church, which didn't just mark time, it gave it meaning. Monks chanting the divine office divided the day into 8 canonical hours, from matins before dawn to compline at nightfall. Each prayer interval was signaled by bells, their peals echoing across fields and rooftops, calling everyone to pause, reflect, or work. These weren't mere reminders, they were the heartbeat of the community. A baker might not know it was 6:15, but he knew exactly when to pull bread from the oven by the sound of prime bells ringing mid-morning. Markets opened at tierce, and families gathered for supper after vespers. This wasn't just timekeeping, it was time woven into faith, labor, and daily survival. Yet nature's timekeeping had its limits. Cloudy days left sundials useless, and winter nights dragged on without moonlight. That's why medieval cities turned to ingenious alternatives like candle clocks, where notches in wax marked the hours as it burned, or water clocks that dripped steadily in monastic scriptoriums. Even the human body became a clock. Town criers walked the streets calling the hours, while night watchmen kept vigil with hourglasses filled with sand. These methods weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. precision mattered less than rhythm, knowing when to sow, when to feast, when to rest. And that's where the sundial comes in, the first true timekeeper of the medieval world. Simple yet profound, it transformed sunlight into something you could read like a book. A shadow's length told farmers when to water crops, told merchants when stalls would close, told mothers when to expect children home. It was more than a tool, it was a bridge between heaven and earth, turning the sun's arc into a language everyone understood. Sundials were the silent guardians of medieval timekeeping, turning sunlight into a language everyone could read. Picture a stone disc mounted on the side of a cathedral, its face carved with intricate lines and Roman numerals. As the sun moved, a metal gnomon, the sundial's pointer, cast a shadow that crept from one mark to the next, dividing the day into manageable chunks. These weren't just tools, they were public landmarks, often placed in bustling squares where merchants, farmers, and travelers could glance up and sync their routines. Some sundials even bore poetic inscriptions like, "I count only the sunny hours," reminding people that time was a gift, not just a measurement. But sundials were more than decorative, they were deeply practical. Monks used them to schedule prayers, farmers relied on them to gauge when to tend fields, and town councils set meeting times by their shadows. The simplest versions were just scratches on a wall, while others were masterpieces of stonework, angled precisely for a city's latitude. In places like Chartres or Canterbury, sundials doubled as art, their designs echoing the sacred geometry of the churches they adorned. Yet for all their elegance, sundials had one glaring flaw: they demanded sunlight. A cloudy day could leave an entire city in temporal limbo, with no way to track the hours until the skies cleared. That's where water clocks came in, offering a solution that flowed as steadily as a river. Unlike sundials, these devices worked day or night, rain or shine. Imagine a large bowl with a small hole at the bottom, filled to the brim at dawn. As water trickled out, markings on the inside revealed how much time had passed, a literal countdown of the day. Monasteries perfected this system, using it to regulate prayers during long winter nights when sundials were useless. Some water clocks were elaborate, with gears and floats that triggered bells or even animated figurines to mark the hours. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian reportedly had a water clock so advanced it could chime different tones for day and night. Yet water clocks had their own quirks. The rate of flow changed with temperature. Water dripped slower in winter, faster in summer, and someone had to refill them constantly. But in a world without precision, consistency mattered less than rhythm. What's fascinating is how these two systems, sundials and water clocks, coexisted, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. Together, they wove a tapestry of time that was flexible, communal, and deeply human. The sundial connected people to the heavens, the water clock tied them to the earth. One marked the divine, the other the mundane, and between them, medieval life found its pulse. Water clocks, known as clepsydras to the ancient world, brought a fluid rhythm to medieval life quite literally. Picture a monk in a dimly lit scriptorium, bending over a bowl as water drips steadily through a small hole. Each drop marks another moment closer to prayer, another hour of labor or contemplation. These devices weren't just functional, they were marvels of their age. Some were as simple as a clay vessel with markings inside, while others boasted gears and floats that triggered bells or even miniature theatrical performances. In Byzantium, the emperor's palace reportedly housed a water clock so elaborate it could chime different melodies for daylight and darkness, turning timekeeping into a spectacle. Yet for all their ingenuity, water clocks had a temperamental side. The same liquid that measured time could betray it, flowing slower in winter's chill or faster in summer's heat. Monks tasked with maintaining these devices faced constant adjustments, refilling reservoirs and clearing mineral buildup from spouts. In colder regions, freezing temperatures could bring the entire system to a standstill, leaving communities to rely on guesswork until the ice thawed. And then there was the noise, the endless drip, drip, drip that filled quiet cloisters, a sound both reassuring and relentless. What's fascinating is how these imperfections didn't diminish the water clock's role, they humanized it. Unlike today's atomic precision, medieval timekeeping embraced fluctuation. A prayer might begin a few drops late, but that hardly mattered when the rhythm of life was collective, not compulsive. Water clocks mirrored the natural world they sprang from, imperfect, adaptable, and deeply interconnected with daily rituals. When the abbey's clepsydra signaled none, the 9th hour, laborers knew it was time to pause for bread and ale, not because a master demanded it, but because the water's flow had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. And then there were the candle clocks, a portable, flickering answer to water's whims. Imagine a tallow candle marked with evenly spaced notches, burning steadily through the night in a merchant's home or a midwife's chamber. Each melting notch signaled another hour passed, another watchful moment in the darkness. Unlike water clocks, candles needed no refilling, no protection from frost, just a steady hand to trim the wick. They were democracy in action, bringing timekeeping out of monasteries and into everyday homes. Yet even fire had its quirks. A draft could hasten the burn, while poor quality wax might gutter unpredictably. Together, these methods, water and flame, reveal a truth about medieval time. It wasn't about control, but harmony. Sundials tied humanity to the heavens, water clocks to the earth, and candles to the intimate glow of human spaces. Each was flawed, yet together they formed a tapestry of moments, a way of moving through the world that valued rhythm over rigidity. When the monastery bell rang at matins, when the candle's final notch dissolved into wax, when the last drop fell from the clepsydra at dawn, these weren't just measurements. They were reminders that time, like water or flame, was a force to be lived within, not conquered. Candle clocks turned something as ordinary as a flickering flame into a measure of time, proof that necessity breeds invention even with the humblest materials. Picture a beeswax candle standing tall in a monastery's shadowy chapel, its sides etched with evenly spaced lines. As the flame burned downward, each notch marked another hour of prayer, another chapter in the night's quiet vigil. These weren't just candles, they were timekeepers, their steady glow slicing darkness into manageable portions. Some versions held small metal balls embedded in the wax. When the flame reached a certain point, the ball would drop into a brass tray with a sharp clang, jolting drowsy monks awake for midnight devotions. What made candle clocks so remarkable was their accessibility. Unlike sundials or water clocks, which required craftsmanship or running water, anyone could carve notches into a candle and track time by firelight. Merchants timed shifts in their workshops by how much wax had melted. Midwives gauged labor progress by the shrinking taper at a bedside. Even households without wealth or status could mark the hours this way. So long as there was tallow or beeswax, there was a clock. But fire, like time itself, was fickle. A sudden draft could make the flame dance erratically, burning through notches faster than expected. Poor quality wax might pool unevenly, distorting the count. Yet these imperfections didn't render candle clocks useless, they simply mirrored life's unpredictability. When a candle burned too quickly, people adjusted. When it guttered out too soon, they relit it. Timekeeping wasn't about precision, it was about persistence, about finding rhythm in the unreliable. Churches took this concept further with marked candles that burned for specific rituals. In medieval England, the Paschal candle, lit during Easter ceremonies, stood as tall as a person. its wax infused with incense, its burning time to sacred events. The flicker of these candles didn't just mark hours, it marked eternity, a visual reminder that time was both fleeting and sacred. And then there were the alarm candles, ancestors of today's buzzing smartphone alerts. Imagine a candle with nails stuck horizontally at intervals. As the wax melted, each nail would fall with a metallic ping, signaling a new hour or task. Night watchmen relied on these to time their rounds, while students used them to ration study sessions by candlelight. The simplicity was genius: no gears, no water, just fire and gravity collaborating to shape the day. Yet candle clocks did more than tell time, they transformed it into something tangible. Watching wax drip was like watching sand fall through an hourglass, a visceral reminder that moments couldn't be hoarded. The very act of lighting a candle at dusk became a ritual, a way to acknowledge night's arrival and the body's need for rest. Unlike today's digital clocks that flicker numbers in the void, candle clocks engage the senses: the warmth on your skin, the scent of melting beeswax, the sound of a weight hitting metal. Time wasn't abstract, it was something you could see, smell, and touch. This intimacy made candle clocks more than tools, they were companions. A traveler might light one in an inn to gauge how long until dawn. A scholar would position it near parchment to track hours of transcription. Each flame carried a quiet urgency, a reminder that light and time was finite. And then, cutting through the quiet hum of candlelit rooms, came the sound that unified entire cities, the deep, resonant toll of church bells. While candles marked private time, bells orchestrated public life, their peals sweeping across rooftops to synchronize thousands of lives into a single, shared rhythm. Church bells didn't just mark time, they commanded it, their bronze voices rolling over rooftops and fields like an invisible hand guiding the rhythm of life. Picture standing in a crowded marketplace when the deep, resonant toll of the nun bell shatters the chatter. Stalls close in unison, merchants pack their wares, and laborers wipe their brows, not because a clock told them to, but because the sound itself carried authority. These weren't mere notifications, they were the pulse of the city, a shared language that even the illiterate could understand. The bell tower stood as the tallest structure in most towns, ensuring its voice reached every alley, every hovel, every open field where workers bent over plows. The secret to their power lay in their consistency. Unlike sundials or candle clocks, bells worked in any weather, day or night. Monasteries and churches maintained strict schedules, with bell ringers trained to strike the hours with unerring precision. Matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, tierce mid-morning. Each canonical hour had its own distinct cadence, a musical code that told people not just when but what to do. A rapid, frantic peal might signal fire or invasion, while the slow, mournful toll of a passing bell reminded the living of time's inevitable end. Even the bells themselves had hierarchies: the great Sanctus bell for mass, smaller ones for daily devotions, each cast with inscriptions like, "I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning." But bells did more than organize, they unified. When the Vesper bell rang at dusk, rich and poor alike paused. Nobles laid down their quills, farmers drove livestock home, and children scrambled back from play. In an era without personal timepieces, this collective rhythm created a rare equality. Everyone, from bishop to blacksmith, moved to the same cadence. Towns even fined citizens for ignoring curfew bells, proof of how deeply timekeeping was tied to order. And in moments of crisis, bells became lifelines, their urgent clangor summoning crowds to quell fires or repel raiders, turning scattered individuals into a coordinated force. What's often overlooked is the artistry behind the sound. Bell ringers weren't just timekeepers, They were musicians weaving patterns into their strikes to signal specific events. The Gabriel ring might announce a birth, while the passing bell rolled in slow, measured strokes for the dead. In some cities, carillons played melodies at noon, transforming timekeeping into public performance. The bells of Notre Dame in Paris were so renowned that their casting was a civic event, with crowds gathering to watch molten bronze poured into molds. Yet even bells had limits. Fog could muffle their reach, and conflicting peals from rival parishes sometimes caused confusion. But their greatest strength was adaptability. When mechanical clocks arrived in the 14th century, many were built into existing bell towers, their gears syncing with the older acoustic tradition. The bells didn't disappear, they evolved, their voices now timed by iron mechanisms rather than human hands. This brings us to the silent partner of medieval timekeeping, the sky itself. While bells governed life on the ground, astronomers looked upward, decoding celestial movements to refine humanity's grasp of time. Monks tracked solstices to fix Easter's date, sailors navigated by the North Star's steady position, and scholars charted planetary cycles to predict eclipses. The heavens were the original clock, a vast, unerring mechanism that medieval minds learned to read like a divine blueprint. Astronomy transformed the night sky into a grand celestial clockface for medieval scholars, who saw in the stars not just beauty but a divine schedule. While sundials and bells marked the hours on Earth, the heavens above offered a far grander scale of timekeeping, one that dictated when to plant crops, when to celebrate holy days, and even when kings should wage war. Monks in secluded scriptoria pored over star charts, their ink-stained fingers tracing the paths of planets to predict eclipses that would send superstitious villagers into panic. Farmers studied the Pleiades clusters rising to know when frost would end, while navigators steered ships by Polaris' steadfast glow. Time wasn't just measured in hours here, it unfolded in the slow dance of constellations across generations. At the heart of this cosmic timekeeping was the astrolabe, a handheld marvel of brass and precision that could map the stars as easily as a modern app. Picture a scholar on a monastery's rooftop at dusk, turning the device's pierced discs until the pattern matched the visible sky. With a few adjustments, he could calculate the hour, determine the date of Easter, or even forecast the best time for bloodletting, a practice still tied to lunar phases. Astrolabes weren't just tools, they were portable observatories compressing the vastness of space into a palm-sized disk. Islamic astronomers perfected their design, and by the 12th century, European thinkers like Chaucer wrote instruction manuals for them. The quadrant, a simpler cousin, let sailors measure the sun's angle at noon to estimate latitude, proof that celestial timekeeping was as practical as it was profound. What's striking is how these astronomical methods intertwined with faith. Church scholars agonized over calendar reforms because Easter's date relied on the spring equinox, a celestial event that didn't align neatly with human math. When the Julian calendar drifted out of sync, crops were planted too early, festivals fell in the wrong season, and the very rhythm of sacred life faltered. Monastic chroniclers became accidental scientists, recording solstices and equinoxes with monastic discipline, their observations later helping to refine the Gregorian calendar we use today. The sky wasn't just a clock, it was a scripture written in light demanding interpretation. Now imagine the quiet revolution of the hourglass, where time became something you could hold in your hands. Unlike water clocks that froze or candle clocks that guttered, this simple device, two glass bulbs connected by a narrow passage, brought reliable measurement to storm-tossed ships and dimly lit studies. Sailors timed their watches by the steady stream of sand, knowing that when the last grain fell, their shift was over. Scholars like Galileo used miniature versions to measure short intervals, while preachers placed large ones on pulpits to curb overlong sermons. The hourglass's magic lay in its democracy. Rich or poor, anyone could own one, and its silent countdown required no literacy to understand. Yet even this innovation had celestial roots. The finest hourglasses were filled with marble dust ground to match the sands of Egypt, a nod to ancient astronomy's birthplace. Their shape echoed the cosmos itself, two spheres representing heaven and earth, united by the thin passage of moments. When the sands ran out, you didn't just flip the glass, you mirrored the eternal cycle of time, where endings were always beginnings in disguise. Hourglasses turned something as ordinary as sand into a precision instrument, proof that sometimes the simplest solutions endure the longest. Picture a ship's cabin in the middle of a winter gale, the wooden hull creaking as waves crash against it. Amid the chaos, a glass bulb filled with fine marble dust sits bolted to a table, its grains slipping steadily downward. No matter how violently the ship rolls, the sand falls at the same rate, marking 30-minute watches with unshakable reliability. Unlike water clocks that would slosh over in rough seas or candle flames that might extinguish in the damp, the hourglass was steadfast. It became the unsung hero of navigation, allowing sailors to calculate speed by measuring how far the ship traveled between flips of the glass, a technique called dead reckoning that guided explorers across uncharted oceans. What made hourglasses revolutionary was their adaptability. Universities used them to time lectures, ensuring no scholar droned on past his allotted span. Cooks relied on miniature versions to gauge boiling eggs or baking bread. In courtrooms, lawyers' arguments were limited by the turn of a large sand-filled glass, preventing endless speeches. Even the infamous witch tests of the Middle Ages sometimes employed hourglasses. Accused women were forced to recite prayers while sand drained, with any stumble taken as proof of demonic influence. The hourglass wasn't just a timer, it was a universal language of duration, understood from royal courts to peasant kitchens. The finest hourglasses were works of art. Venetian glassblowers crafted bulbs so perfectly symmetrical that sand flowed without catching, while German artisans used powdered eggshells for ultra-fine grains. Some were encased in elaborate frames of ivory or ebony, their turning mechanisms fitted with chimes to signal when time had elapsed, but their true genius lay in their democracy. A farmer could fashion a crude version from 2 blown glass bottles and beach sand, while a prince might commission one adorned with gold leaf. Timekeeping, once the domain of monasteries and elites, was now literally in everyone's hands. Yet hourglasses had their own poetry. The act of flipping them became a ritual of physical acknowledgement that time was both cyclical and finite. The sands never paused, never sped up. They simply fell, grain by grain, indifferent to human worries. This made them powerful symbols in art and literature, where they often appeared in paintings of saints or scenes of mortality, a quiet reminder that even kings answered to time's unrelenting flow. As cities grew louder and more crowded, though, a new challenge emerged: how to synchronize thousands of lives without relying on individual devices. The answer came not from sand or water, but from the very streets themselves, public clocks that turned timekeeping into a shared spectacle. Imagine the awe when Strasbourg's astronomical clock debuted in the 14th century, its mechanical apostles parading at noon while a rooster crowed and death himself struck the hour. These weren't just timekeepers, they were theater, merging precision with pageantry to make time visible to all. Before mechanical clocks conquered town squares, human voices kept cities in rhythm, town criers who turned timekeeping into a public performance. Imagine a figure in a brightly colored tunic climbing the steps of the market cross at noon, his voice cutting through the din of merchants and livestock. High noon and all's well, he'd shout, his call echoing down narrow streets where sundials couldn't reach. These weren't just announcements, they were acts of community, a way to stitch scattered lives into a shared schedule. In places like London or Bruges, criers were paid in ale or coin to walk specific routes, their cries syncing the bustle of trade with the slower pulse of domestic life. A fishmonger might hear tierce and know the morning auctions were ending, while a weaver would pause at the call of nuns to bank her loom's fire for the midday meal. The job demanded more than a loud voice, it required trust. Criers often doubled as news bearers, their proclamations carrying the weight of law. To falsify the hour was as serious as forging a royal decree, which is why many swore oaths on relics before taking up their post. Some towns even employed children as hour shouters, their high-pitched voices carrying farther in crowded alleys. In winter, when fog smothered bell towers or ice silenced water clocks, these human timekeepers became the only link to order, their cries slicing through the gloom like a lantern's beam. What's fascinating is how their role blurred the line between timekeeping and time-making. A crier might delay announcing noon slightly on market days to give farmers extra hours to sell goods, or speed up evening calls in winter to protect travelers from curfew penalties. Time wasn't just measured, it was negotiated, bent to serve the needs of the community. This flexibility reveals a truth modern schedules often ignore. Timekeeping works best when it serves people, not the other way around. Yet even human clocks had rivals. In maritime cities like Venice, the position of water time caller tracked tidal hours, shouting when lagoon gates should open for ships. Monks known as horologists kept intricate candle charts, whispering the hour to scribes in scriptoriums where ink froze in winter. These variations weren't contradictions, they were adaptations, proving time could flow differently for sailors, scholars, and cobblers while still holding society together. The real magic lay in how these systems intertwined. A sundial might govern a cathedral's bells, which set the crier's schedule, which in turn told the candlemaker when to replenish the abbey's tapers. Time rippled outward from these points like circles in a pond, each ring astronomical, mechanical, human, reinforcing the others, and beneath it all pulsed the oldest clock of all, the seasons, whose rhythms no bell or flame could override. When spring's first warmth touched the fields, entire cities shifted tempo. Plows bit into thawed earth at dawn's first light, far earlier than winter's late sunrise would allow. Harvest weeks saw labor stretch from cockcrow to owl light, with church bells bending their usual cycles to accommodate the urgency of reaping. Winter tightened the schedule again, compressing work into precious daylight hours while alehouses glowed into the night with candlelit revelry. Time wasn't just marked by these changes, it was made by them, woven into the very sweat and sinew of survival. This seasonal dance was so ingrained that medieval calendars, those colorful books of hours, depicted each month not with abstract numbers but with labors, pruning vines in March, shearing sheep in June, slaughtering pigs as December's days shrank. Even the word hour came from the Greek hora, meaning season. To track time was to track the body's work, the land's yield, the earth's tilt toward or away from the sun. Modern life has blurred these rhythms, but traces remain. Think of daylight saving time, a faint echo of humanity's ancient pact with the sky. And that's the real lesson of medieval timekeeping. It wasn't about domination, but harmony. Sundials bowed to clouds, water clocks to frost, human voices to fatigue. The systems acknowledged their flaws, adapting as needed because time, in the end, was never meant to be a cage, just a shared path through the turning world. The rhythm of the medieval year moved to two great beats, the turning of the seasons and the turning of the liturgical calendar. This wasn't just a way to mark time, it was a way to live time, woven into the sweat of plowed fields and the chance of feast days. Picture a farmer in 9th century France, his hands calloused from the plow, glancing at the oak tree's buds to know when to sow barley. He didn't need a parchment calendar. Nature's signals were everywhere. The first cuckoo's call meant vines could be pruned, while the yellowing of hazel leaves warned of autumn's approach. Yet layered atop these earthly signs was something equally powerful: the church's feast days, which acted like anchors in the year's flow. Michaelmas on September 29th wasn't just a celebration of the archangel, it was the day rents were due, geese were slaughtered, and the fishing season ended. Easter's movable date dictated when to plant spring wheat, its timing tied to the moon's phases like an agricultural alarm clock. This fusion of celestial and sacred created a calendar so intuitive that even the illiterate could navigate it. Saints' days functioned as mnemonic devices, a way to remember tasks as reliably as modern farmers check weather apps. Saint Benedict's feast on March 21st. Time to graft apple trees. St. John's Eve in June. Light bonfires to ward off crop blight. The year became a story, each chapter marked by labor and liturgy. Manuscripts like the Tres Riches Hura's du Dr. Berry captured this beautifully, painting each month with its defining chore: February's sheep huddling in snow, August's golden wheat harvest. These weren't abstract divisions, they were survival itself. What's striking is how fluid time remained within this structure. A day's work in July, when light stretched past 9 in the evening, might mean 14 hours of labor, while December's feeble sun shortened it to 6. Villagers adjusted seamlessly, their bodies attuned to light's ebb and flow in ways our electric-lit world has forgotten. Even the church acknowledged this flexibility. Canonical hours like prime or vespers weren't fixed to clock time. They shifted with the seasons, ensuring prayers aligned with dawn and dusk no matter how the days lengthened or shrank. This harmony between earth and spirit reached its peak in the labors of the months, a visual tradition etched into cathedral portals and illuminated manuscripts. Here, time wasn't represented by numbers but by actions: a man pruning vines for March, a woman shearing sheep for June, a family feasting for December. These images reinforced a profound truth: time's value lay in what it produced, not just in its passing. The modern obsession with saving time would have baffled medieval minds. Time wasn't a currency to hoard, but a current to ride, like a river carrying seeds to fertile ground. Yet within this seasonal dance, precision still had its place, especially when the sun alone couldn't answer every need. As cities grew and trade expanded, sundials evolved from simple scratch marks on church walls to sophisticated instruments that could account for a location's latitude. Picture a 13th century mason in Chartres, chiseling a horizontal sundial into the cathedral's south facade. Unlike earlier vertical designs that only worked at certain times of day, these new dials used angled gnomons to track the sun's arc from dawn to dusk. Some even featured curved hour lines to compensate for the sun's changing speed across seasons, a medieval algorithm etched in stone. The most advanced designs, like the shepherd's dial, were portable. A traveler could hold the small brass disc upright, letting its weighted string act as a gnomon to cast a shadow on engraved hour lines. These weren't just tools, they were marvels of practical geometry, proof that medieval ingenuity could compress the cosmos into a pocket-sized companion. And as sundials grew more precise, they began to reveal something unsettling. The sun's time and mankind's time didn't always match. On a sundial, noon occurred when the sun reached its highest point, but that moment varied between towns just a few miles apart. This solar time chaos would eventually spur the need for standardized clocks, but for centuries, sundials held sway, their shadows stitching the heavens to human routines. What's often overlooked is how these devices bridged classes. A noble's sundial might be cast in silver with zodiac engravings, while a farmer's was a stick planted in the ground beside his field. Yet both told the same truth. Time was sunlight made tangible, a gift poured equally on rich and poor. That democratizing power, the idea that a shadow didn't care about your title, might explain why sundials often bore mottos like, "I count none but sunny hours." They weren't just measuring time, they were measuring life's fleeting beauty. And so, as the medieval world turned, time remained a tapestry, threads of astronomy, agriculture, and faith woven together. The sun dictated the seasons, the saints dictated the festivals, and the sundial translated both into something you could read with your eyes or your hands. It was a system that honored time's dual nature, both relentless and generous, both cosmic and deeply human. The simplest sundials were little more than a stick in the ground, casting a shadow that moved as the sun traveled across the sky. But as medieval cities grew into bustling centers of trade and scholarship, these humble timekeepers evolved into masterpieces of engineering and art. Picture a towering sundial mounted on the facade of a cathedral in 14th century Prague, its face carved with intricate zodiac symbols and Latin inscriptions. Unlike earlier versions that only worked at specific times of day, these advanced dials featured multiple faces angled to catch the sun from dawn to dusk. Some even had curved hour lines to compensate for the Earth's tilt, meaning a monk in winter could read the time just as accurately as a merchant in midsummer. What made these designs revolutionary was their adaptability. A sundial in Venice might include a sliding gnomon to adjust for the city's unique latitude, while one in Oxford could feature a rotating disc to align with seasonal shifts in the sun's path. Craftsmen didn't just carve stone, they encoded celestial mechanics into their designs, turning sunlight into a precision instrument. The most sophisticated examples, like the butterfly dial found in some monasteries, used overlapping arcs to track both solar time and canonical hours, allowing monks to cross-reference prayer schedules with natural light. These weren't just tools, they were medieval supercomputers calculating time without a single gear. Yet the true genius lay in their accessibility. While water clocks required maintenance and candle clocks burned away, a well-built sundial needed only sunlight to function. Towns installed them in central squares where anyone, whether a literate scholar or an illiterate farmer, could glance up and know the hour. Some even included whimsical touches, like the shepherd's dials, small enough to fit in a pocket, with a weighted string that doubled as a gnomon. These portable versions let travelers, shepherds, and merchants carry time with them, turning personal timekeeping into a reality long before pocket watches. But sundials had a deeper influence than mere practicality. Their precision shaped medieval law in unexpected ways. Market hours, legal proceedings, and even curfews were often tied to the sun's position, meaning a sundial's shadow could determine whether a merchant faced fines for selling goods after closing or if a defendant arrived on time for trial. In some cities, discrepancies between sundials led to disputes so heated that councils appointed official dial keepers to maintain and certify public timepieces. The sun might be free but accurate timekeeping that required trust, craftsmanship, and occasionally a city ordinance. This intersection of time and order reached its peak with the noon mark, a simple line etched into church floors. When the sun's rays hit it each midday, the entire city's synchronized bells rang, contracts were sealed, and laborers paused for their bread and ale. The shadow didn't just mark time, it marked fairness, ensuring no one could cheat the system by arguing over the hour. In an age without standardization, these silent sentinels became the closest thing to universal time, proving that even in the medieval world, precision wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation of justice. And so, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, its last rays still clinging to the cathedral's dial, the next shift began, the transition from celestial timekeeping to something more tangible, more enforceable. Because when the shadows faded, the law still needed a way to measure the night. When the church bell tolled curfew in a medieval city, it wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law. Picture the heavy bronze voice rolling over rooftops as darkness fell, signaling every torch to be doused, every door bolted, every citizen off the streets. This wasn't about convenience, it was survival. In an era without streetlights or police patrols, nighttime belonged to dangers real and imagined thieves lurking in shadows, accidental fires spreading through thatched roofs, even superstitions about wandering spirits. The curfew bell, derived from the old French couvre-feu meaning cover the fire, was timekeeping as civic armor, but curfews were just the beginning. From dawn to dusk, bells orchestrated the rhythm of commerce and labor with ironclad precision. Market bells rang at prime to signal the opening of stalls, their peals sending farmers and merchants scrambling to arrange wares before the crowds arrived. Any trader caught selling after the closing bell faced fines or confiscated goods, medieval equivalents of today's business licenses revoked. In London's Cheapside, the poultry bell governed poultry sales, while York's Ouse Bridge bell dictated when fishermen could auction their catch. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were the glue holding fragile economies together, ensuring fair competition and preventing shady deals under cover of darkness. The penalties for ignoring time's authority could be shockingly creative. A baker in 14th century Paris caught selling undersized loaves after hours might find himself strapped into the pilori, a public stocks where rotten produce rained down on him. In German towns, merchants who violated market hours risked having their goods auctioned off for charity. The strictest laws governed alcohol. Taverns in medieval England had to stop serving when the ale bell rang at 9. A rule enforced by officials who'd smash any tankard still in use. Time wasn't just measured, it was policed, with consequences as tangible as the coins in a merchant's purse. What's fascinating is how these time laws reveal medieval society's balancing act between control and community. On one hand, the bells were tools of authority. Kings and councils used them to assert power, much like today's government clocks' standardized time zones. But they also served as equalizers. When the curfew bell rang, even nobles had to extinguish their hearths like commoners, reducing fire risks for entire neighborhoods. Market bells gave small vendors the same selling window as wealthy guildsmen, preventing monopolies. The very act of collective timekeeping of thousands pausing or bustling at the same signal created a shared rhythm that transcended class. Monasteries took this concept further, turning timekeeping into spiritual discipline. Behind cloistered walls, the bells didn't just mark hours, they shaped consciousness itself. Matins at 2 in the morning, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise. Each canonical hour summoned monks from sleep, work, or study to prayer, conditioning minds to view time as sacred currency. The rule of Saint Benedict, which organized monastic life into precise intervals, famously warned, "To delay in obedience is to delay in the love of God." For medieval Christians, punctuality wasn't just practical, it was piety in motion. This monastic obsession with temporal order would ripple far beyond chapel walls. As Europe's first institutional timekeepers, monasteries didn't just follow schedules, they exported them. Their water clocks calibrated town bells, their candle clocks timed night watches, their astronomical observations refined harvest calendars. When mechanical clocks emerged in the 14th century, it was often monastic engineers who designed them, transferring celestial rhythms into gear trains. The very word clock comes from the Latin clocca bell, a permanent reminder of where modern timekeeping was born, in the echoing vaults where faith and precision met. Monastic timekeeping didn't just echo within cloistered walls, it spilled into the streets, reshaping how entire cities understood order and rhythm. But what about places far from monastery bells, where no tower stood to slice the day into neat portions? Across Europe's remote valleys and sprawling farmlands, communities developed their own ingenious ways to track time, proving that even without iron bells or water clocks, human ingenuity could bend nature into a schedule. Take the shepherd watching his flock in the Scottish Highlands, far from any town's curfew bell. To him, time wasn't measured in hours but in shadows, the way a particular peak's silhouette crept across the valley floor, signaling when to move sheep to fresh pasture. Or consider the fishing villages of Normandy, where tides dictated life more rigidly than any abbot's rule. The moon's pull set the fishermen's clocks, their boats launching not at a fixed hour, but when the water reached a specific mark on the harbor stones. These weren't crude methods, they were precise adaptations, turning landscapes into living timepieces. In dense forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, lumbermen used tree sap as their clock. Maple tapped fastest at midday, slowing by dusk, a natural hourglass they could taste. Vineyard workers timed pruning by the swelling of buds, knowing that cutting too early or too late meant a poor harvest. Even children playing in fields became unwitting timekeepers, their shadows stretching to certain lengths before mothers called them home for supper. The real marvel was how these decentralized systems synchronized with broader timekeeping networks. A farmer might check his sundial, a flat stone with a stick planted upright, then adjust his schedule to align with the weekly market day's distant bells. Peddlers carried news of time along with their wares, spreading word when a nearby monastery's clock was repaired or when a town's new bell tower was completed. Time flowed through these connections like water through cracks in stone, finding its own level. What unified these methods wasn't precision but purpose. Whether tracking tides or tree shadows, each system answered the same urgent question: when is the right moment to act? For the miller, it was when the river's current ran strongest. For the midwife, when the candle burned to the third notch. Time wasn't abstract, it was the difference between ripe grain and rotten, between a safe crossing and a shipwreck. And so, while monasteries may have written the rulebook on structured timekeeping, ordinary people authored their own chapters, proving that even without technology, humanity never truly lost track of time. We simply listened to the world more closely, hearing its rhythms in the whisper of leaves, the cry of birds, the pulse of the land itself. In remote villages far from grand cathedrals and mechanical clocks, timekeeping became an art of observation and adaptation. The crow of a rooster at first light wasn't just a rural cliché, it was the alarm clock of an entire community, signaling shepherds to drive flocks to pasture and bakers to stoke their ovens. Without towering sundials or intricate water clocks, villagers turned their surroundings into living timepieces. A farmer might note how the sunlight hit a particular notch in the hills behind his field, marking midday as reliably as any bell. Mothers taught children to gauge the hour by the length of their shadows. When your shadow is twice your height, fetch the goats home. These methods weren't crude estimates. They were precise enough to coordinate planting, harvesting, and even local markets. Church bells still played a role, even when the nearest steeple was miles away. On quiet mornings, sound traveled astonishingly far across open countryside. A village might sync its day to the faint tolling of a distant monastery's prime bell, carried on the wind like a whispered secret. In some places, a lookout would climb the highest tree or hill to listen for the bells, then shout the hour to the valley below. This chain of sound bronze to human voice bound scattered communities to a shared rhythm, proving timekeeping could stretch across distances without a single gear or dial. But nature's timekeepers had their own language. Bees returning to their hives signaled late afternoon, while the evening chorus of frogs marked twilight's approach. In coastal villages, the tides dictated schedules more strictly than any abbey's rule. Fishermen knew that when the water reached the third barnacle-covered rock on the jetty, it was time to haul nets. Alpine communities tracked the sun's path between mountain peaks, naming each sun gate where light appeared at specific seasons. These weren't just survival tricks, they were evidence of time's deep entanglement with place. The real test came when villages connected to wider trade networks. A merchant arriving at a market town by mid-morning light might find himself hours late compared to a city measuring time by mechanical clocks. As commerce grew, so did the need for synchronization. A farmer selling wool in York couldn't rely on his local hill's shadow when the marketplace ran on the cathedral's bells. This collision of rural and urban timekeeping sparked quiet revolutions, villages installing their first sundials near crossroads, or local lords funding a small bell tower to align with regional markets. Time was no longer just local, it was becoming a currency, measurable and tradable. What's striking is how these adaptations reveal timekeeping's true purpose, not control but connection. Whether through a rooster's cry or a borrowed church bell's echo, communities found ways to weave their lives into a larger tapestry. The shepherd might not care what hour the king's court called noon, but he knew exactly when to meet the wool buyer at the crossroads because time, in the end, was less about numbers than about trust. And as trade routes stretched farther, that trust would demand ever more precise ways to say, "I'll meet you when." Trade routes stretched like veins across medieval Europe, pulsing with wool, spices, and silver, but none of this commerce could flow without shared time. Picture a merchant from Florence waiting at the champagne fairs, his silk bolts unpacked as he watches the sun creep across the marketplace. Without synchronized hours, how would he know when the Flemish cloth sellers would arrive? How could a shipmaster in Venice coordinate with caravan drivers in Aleppo when every city marked noon at a different moment? The chaos of solar time, where clocks in Milan and Paris disagreed by minutes or even hours, wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a barrier to profit. This economic pressure sparked the first inklings of standardized time. Some trading hubs installed public sundials calibrated to local solar noon, allowing merchants to adjust their portable sundials upon arrival. Clever innkeepers along busy routes kept merchant clocks, water clocks, or candle clocks reset daily to the town bell, so travelers could synchronize their schedules. The hottest commodity wasn't just silk or salt. It was reliable information about when markets opened, when tolls were collected, when ships sailed with the tide. Time became a currency as tangible as the coins in a trader's purse. The real game changer was the rise of mechanical clocks in the 14th century, their gears cutting through the fog of temporal chaos. When the great clock of Strasbourg Cathedral began chiming equal-length hours in 1354, it didn't just awe peasants, it offered merchants something revolutionary: predictability. Now a contract could specify delivery by the third hour afternoon. Without arguing over whose noon, clocks spread fastest along trade routes, their towers rising in port cities and market towns like a network of temporal lighthouses. The more commerce a city handled, the more precise its timekeeping needed to be. Genoa's dockmasters fined captains for late unloading by the clock's verdict, while Bruges will exchange adjusted interest rates by the hour. Yet night remained time's final frontier. When the sun vanished, so did most reliable markers until enterprising cities turned fire into a clock. In Lubeck, chainmen patrolled the streets with torches, lighting designated lanterns at set intervals to mark the night watches. Venetian harbor masters kept calibrated oil lamps burning in towers, their wicks trimmed to burn down at a fixed rate, signaling when late ships could still dock. Even the stars got a commercial makeover. Mediterranean navigators memorized star paths not just for direction, but to estimate how many hours remained until dawn's market opening. What's striking is how these innovations transformed time from a local rhythm into a web of connections. A banker in Barcelona could now trust that a bill marked payable in 30 days meant the same in Bordeaux. The ticking of gears wasn't just progress, it was the sound of the medieval world stitching itself together, one shared hour at a time. Nightfall in a medieval city wasn't just the end of daylight, it was a transformation of reality itself. Imagine streets plunged into near total darkness, where the only flickers of light came from the occasional torch guttering in a bracket or the glow of a hearth through a shuttered window. Without modern artificial lighting, night wasn't merely a time of day. It was a different world governed by its own rhythms and rules. The curfew bell's final toll didn't just signal bedtime, it was a warning, a command to extinguish fires and retreat behind locked doors. In cities like London or Paris, venturing out after dark without a lantern wasn't just risky, it was illegal, punishable by fines or even imprisonment. The night belonged to watchmen whose echoing calls of "all's well" were less reassurance than ritual, a fragile assertion of order in the consuming dark. Yet darkness wasn't just a barrier, it was a canvas for medieval ingenuity. Some cities strung chains of fire, beacons along walls or towers, their flames refueled at set intervals to mark the night's progression. In Nuremberg, iron lanterns filled with slow-burning oil hung at crossroads, their light calibrated to last until dawn. These weren't streetlights as we know them. They were temporal landmarks, dividing the night into watch shifts for guards or signaling when late travelers could still enter city gates. Monasteries took a quieter approach, timing nocturnal prayers with calibrated candles that burned down to notches, their flicker guiding monks through the divine office while the world outside slept. The contrast to today's electrified nights couldn't be sharper. Where modern cities pulse with light all night, medieval darkness forced surrender to natural cycles. Workers rose and rested with the sun, their bodies tuned to seasons rather than shifts. The few who moved through the night, bakers stoking pre-dawn ovens, midwives summoned to childbirths, did so with caution, their lanterns cutting fragile paths through a world where shadows hid very real dangers. Thieves, wolves, or simply the peril of a misplaced step into a pitch-black ditch. This nightly retreat wasn't just practical, it shaped culture itself. Storytellers spun tales of ghosts and demons that walked at midnight, reinforcing curfews with folklore. Night watchmen's calls became a kind of auditory clock, their cries of 12 o'clock and all's well, slicing the void into manageable chunks. Even the stars took on new urgency. Without artificial light, constellations were brilliantly clear, and farmers knew the position of Ursa Major at midnight meant it was time to check on lambing ewes. Amid this dance of fire and shadow, scholars pondered time's very nature. In candlelit scriptoriums, monks debated whether time was linear or cyclical, while alchemists tracked nocturnal planetary movements, convinced celestial alignments held secrets. The night's enforced stillness became a laboratory for theorizing time itself, not as gears and bells, but as something woven into the fabric of existence. And it was in these hushed hours between the watchman's call and the first hint of dawn that medieval minds began to untangle the threads of time's deepest mysteries. Medieval thinkers didn't just measure time, they wrestled with its very nature, and their ideas rippled through the cobblestone streets of cities in ways we'd never expect. Take Bede, the 8th century monk who chronicled England's history while pondering whether time moved in a straight line toward Judgment Day or in repeating cycles like the seasons. His writings didn't just fill parchment, they shaped how monasteries structured their days, turning prayer schedules into arguments about eternity. Then there was Thomas Aquinas, who saw time as a river flowing from God's hand, a concept that seeped into cathedral clocks, where mechanical angels struck bells not just to mark hours, but to remind townsfolk of divine order. These weren't abstract debates, they were blueprints for living. When a farmer heard the Vesper bell, he wasn't just hearing a call to prayer, he was hearing Aquinas' belief that every moment was a gift to be used wisely. But how did these lofty ideas translate into something as lively as a festival? Imagine the Feast of Fools, where towns turned hierarchy upside down for a day, peasants crowned as kings, priests telling bawdy jokes, all because medieval thinkers saw time as both sacred and subversive. The church might have preached linear time marching toward salvation, but the people clung to older, cyclical rhythms where misrule was as natural as harvest and hibernation. In places like Nuremberg, New Year's wasn't just a date change. It was a bonfire-lit rebirth, echoing pagan solstice rites baptized into Christian calendars. Even the carnival masks of Venice with their frozen grins whispered a medieval truth. Time wasn't just something to measure, it was something to celebrate, to defy, to momentarily outwit. The most vivid fusion of theory and revelry came in the Corpus Christi processions, where entire cities became living clocks. Guilds built floats depicting Bible stories in chronological order, creation to apocalypse parading theology through streets like a ticking timeline. Spectators didn't just watch, they moved through sacred history, their cheers and gasps marking each hour of the divine story. Aquinas would have approved his vision of time as a path to God made literal under summer skies. Meanwhile, in rural villages, maypole dances spun like human sundials, ribbons tracing the sun's arc while revelers laughed at the very idea that time could ever be tamed. What's startling is how these celebrations exposed time's double role, as both taskmaster and playmate. The same church that enforced monastic schedules also greenlit raucous feast days where time seemed to stop. The same cities that fined merchants for missing curfew also suspended all rules during carnival. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was wisdom. Medieval people understood that to endure time's weight, you sometimes had to dance on its scales. Festivals were the fireworks of medieval timekeeping explosions of color and chaos that temporarily shattered the rigid tick-tock of daily life. Take Carnival, those riotous days before Lent when cities like Venice or Cologne became theaters of the absurd. Masked revelers flooded the streets, turning social hierarchies upside down as peasants mocked nobles and children bossed adults. But beneath the laughter lay a sophisticated temporal act. These celebrations marked the year's turning points like living calendars. When maypole dancers wove ribbons around a flower-crowned pole, they weren't just welcoming spring, they were synchronizing their bodies to the Earth's tilt, their movements mirroring the sun's climb higher in the sky. Even the timing of these festivals followed nature's lead. Midsummer bonfires blazed on the solstice itself, their flames echoing the sun's peak, while harvest feasts coincided with the last full moon before autumn's equinox. These events did more than mark time, they massaged it. After months of back-breaking labor, Carnival's madness offered a pressure valve, a sanctioned period where time didn't dictate chores or prayers but bent to human whims. In Nuremberg, the Schembartlauf festival featured runners carrying giant hourglasses filled with confetti instead of sand, symbolizing time's suspension. London's Lord Mayor's parade included floats with mock sundials whose hands spun backward, a cheeky nod to the idea that for a few glorious days the rules didn't apply. This temporal rebellion wasn't just fun, it was survival. Farmers who spent all year enslaved to sunrise and sunset needed moments when night could day, when servants could play kings. The church, despite its love of order, wisely embraced these festivals. By grafting Christian feasts onto pagan solar celebrations, Christmas onto winter solstice, Easter onto spring equinox, it created a hybrid calendar that honored both celestial rhythms and sacred history. Processions for Corpus Christi or St. John's Eve became temporal anchors, their dates fixed while the events themselves taught time's fluidity. In York, the annual mystery plays performed Bible stories in chronological order, literally marching salvation history through the streets. Participants didn't just watch time unfold, they wore its costumes, spoke its lines, became its living markers. Yet even as festivals celebrated time's cyclical nature, something new was stirring in Europe's bustling cities, a technology that would shatter the old rhythms forever. High in the towers of cathedrals and town halls, blacksmiths and monks were tinkering with iron gears and weights, forging the first mechanical clocks. These marvels didn't just tell time, they redefined it, slicing the day into uniform hours regardless of season or sunlight. The clock's steady tick would soon drown out the laughter of carnival, the chants of harvest feasts, the ancient dialogue between humanity and the sky. But that's a story of gears and gravity, one that begins with a single swinging pendulum in a 14th century monastery, where time was about to escape the heavens and fall into human hands. The first mechanical clocks didn't just tell time, they commanded it, their iron hearts beating inside cathedral towers like the pulse of a new age. Picture a 14th century stonemason in Milan, perched on scaffolding as he helps install a monstrous iron contraption high above the city. Below him, merchants pause in the square, squinting upward as gears grind and weights descend, until, with a shuddering clang, the clock's hammer strikes the bell. For the first time in history, time isn't dictated by the sun's arc or a monk's candle, but by the relentless swing of a pendulum. The sound ripples through the streets, equal parts marvel and menace. These early tower clocks were far from precise by modern standards. Losing or gaining 15 minutes a day was common, and their massive iron frames groaned with every gear turn. Yet their impact was seismic. Unlike sundials that fell silent under clouds or water clocks that froze in winter, these machines hammered out equal-length hours regardless of season, winter nights now divided into the same rigid chunks as summer days. For city dwellers, it was liberating and disorienting in equal measure. A baker no longer needed to wait for the shadow of the church spire to know when to pull bread from the oven. The clock's bell would declare it, cutting through fog or darkness with mechanical certainty. But not everyone welcomed this new order. Monks, once the gatekeepers of time, bristled as their meticulously kept candle charts became obsolete. Farmers complained that clock hours ignored nature's rhythms. Why should a field be worked until a bell rang, rather than until the light faded? In some towns, protests erupted when merchants realized these clocks allowed landlords to enforce stricter work hours. A French chronicle from 1382 even records a mob smashing a newly installed clock, shouting that it was stealing the sun's right to rule. The resistance wasn't just about technology, it was about power. Who controlled time now? The heavens, the church, or the town council funding these expensive machines? The backlash revealed a deeper tension between two worlds. In rural areas, life still moved to the old cadence of cockcrow and twilight. But in cities, the clock's chime began reshaping reality. Shop leases specified operating hours by the tower clock, not the sun. Workers' wages were docked for minutes of lateness rather than the old system of morning and afternoon shifts. Even the concept of punctuality was born here, a word derived from the punctures clockmakers made in gear wheels to regulate their motion. Time was no longer a river to wade through. It had become a cage of iron and brass. Yet for all the grumbling, the clock's advantages were undeniable. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, towns with public clocks could coordinate quarantines more effectively, sealing gates at precise hours. Traders from different cities could finally sync their meetings without debating whose sundial was correct. And perhaps most surprisingly, the clocks became symbols of civic pride. Towns competed to build taller towers with louder bells, turning timekeeping into a kind of urban spectacle. The very act of checking the clock became a ritual, a moment when rich and poor alike looked upward in unison, bound by the same ticking heartbeat. By the 15th century, resistance gave way to reliance. The same farmers who once cursed clock towers now adjusted planting schedules to their chimes. Monks traded their candle notches for clock winding duties, folding mechanical time into sacred routines. And in workshops across Europe, artisans began miniaturizing these tower clock mechanisms, laying the groundwork for personal timepieces that would one day sit in pockets and on wrists. The gears of progress turned inexorably, not just measuring time but transforming how humanity moved through it. The age of mechanical time had arrived, and there would be no turning back. Not everyone welcomed the mechanical clock's steady tick with open arms. For some, its iron gears represented something far more unsettling, a theft of time itself from the hands of nature and the rhythms of tradition. Picture a group of 15th century textile workers in Lyon, their faces smudged with dye as they listened to the new town clock mark the end of their shift. What once was measured by the gradual dimming of light through workshop windows was now dictated by a machine's unyielding chime. To these artisans, the clock wasn't progress, it was a tool of control, slicing their labor into rigid portions for the profit of wealthy merchants. In England, riots broke out when landlords began using clock hours to enforce stricter workdays, with protesters smashing timepieces and shouting that God's sun, not man's metal, should rule the day. Even the church, long the guardian of timekeeping, found itself divided. Monasteries that had meticulously tracked hours with candle marks and water clocks now faced a dilemma. Should they abandon centuries of tradition for these new mechanical marvels? Some cloisters resisted, arguing that uniform clock hours disrupted the sacred fluidity of prayer cycles tied to daylight. A Benedictine chronicler grumbled that the clock's equal-length hours made winter vespers feel rushed and hollow, stripped of the contemplative stillness that long nights once afforded. Rural priests warned flocks that relying on machines might make them forget to read the sky's divine clock, where God's will was written in sunrise and storm. This resistance reveals a profound truth. The clock didn't just tell time, it rewrote humanity's relationship with it. Where sundials and candle clocks had bowed to nature's irregularities, mechanical time imposed a grid of precision that privileged cities over countryside, merchants over farmers, employers over laborers. The very language of time shifted. Gone were terms like cockcrow or after the dewdrey, replaced by abstract numbers that could be monetized and regimented. A feudal lord might have cared when the harvest was brought in, but a textile magnate needed to know exactly how many hours his looms operated. Time became currency, and the clock was its mint. Yet beyond Europe, entirely different philosophies of timekeeping flourished, ones that often made Europe's mechanical obsession seem jarringly rigid. In the Islamic world, where prayer times shifted daily with the sun's position, water clocks in mosque courtyards were calibrated to celestial movements, their gears adjusted seasonally to maintain sacred accuracy. Chinese astronomers built elaborate armillary spheres that mapped planetary cycles onto a scale of qi, each key roughly 2 modern hours but varying slightly to harmonize with natural patterns. For the Maya, time wasn't linear at all but a spiral where dates recurred in sacred cycles, their calendars interlocking like gears in a cosmic machine. These contrasts force us to ask, is time something we measure or something we inhabit? The medieval world, with its sundials and candle clocks, lived closer to the latter, until the mechanical clock's gears began turning, pulling humanity into a new rhythm where nature's voice grew faint against the metronome of progress. The echoes of that shift still haunt us today in every buzzing alarm and blinking digital display. While Europe's cathedrals echoed with mechanical clockwork, the Islamic world perfected timekeeping into both science and art. In 9th century Baghdad, the House of Wisdom buzzed with scholars designing water clocks so intricate they seemed alive. Picture the legendary elephant clock of Al-Jazari, a towering brass masterpiece where a mechanical bird chirped the hour while tiny doors swung open to reveal figurines. But these weren't just royal toys, they were spiritual tools. Mosques across the caliphate used water clocks calibrated to the shifting prayer times, their gears adjusted seasonally to match the sun's wandering path. Unlike Europe's equal hour system, Islamic timekeeping bowed to nature's variability. Noon prayers occurred when shadows stood shortest, even if that moment changed daily. This fluidity reflected a profound truth. Time wasn't absolute, but a conversation between earth and heaven. Journey east to China, and timekeeping took on an entirely different rhythm. Here, incense clocks measured hours through fragrance rather than sound or shadow. Imagine a scholar's study where coiled incense sticks smoldered along intricate grooves, each curve designed to burn for exactly 1 key, about 2 modern hours. The scent of sandalwood or musk wasn't just pleasant, it was practical, wafting through rooms to signal the passing hours without disruptive bells. Some imperial versions used powdered incense pressed into zodiac shapes, their glowing embers tracing the celestial animals one by one. For night watches, metal balls were embedded in the incense. As each section burned away, the ball would drop into a bronze tray with a resonant clang. This fusion of sensory beauty and precision captured the Chinese view of time as both art and discipline, a balance mirrored in their astronomical clocks, where water-powered gears turned spheres mapping the harmonious movements of planets. Across the Pacific, the Maya wove time into the very fabric of existence. Their calendar wasn't just a tool but a cosmic loom, interlocking sacred cycles of 260 days with solar years of 365. Priests tracked these cycles using observatories like El Caracol, where narrow windows aligned with Venus's risings, a celestial clock spanning centuries. What seems astonishing today is how these systems, born continents apart, all grappled with the same paradox: how to pin down something as fluid as time while honoring its connection to the infinite. The contrast with Europe's mechanical clocks reveals a cultural fork in the road, where Islamic and Asian systems often bent time to fit natural patterns. European gears began bending nature to fit time's new rigid grid. Yet beneath these differences lay a shared human urgency, the need to harmonize with the cosmos while imposing enough order to plant crops, conduct trade, and pray together. Whether through the scent of incense or the chime of bells, every culture sought to answer time's oldest question: when is the right moment to act? This universal struggle played out in daily routines from Damascus to Chang'an. In Moorish Spain, the Muezzin's call synchronized everything from market openings to siestas, while in Song Dynasty China, drum towers broadcast the night watches to fire patrols and lantern-lighted tea houses. The Maya timed planting ceremonies to the zenith passage of the sun, a moment when shadows vanished entirely, as if time itself held its breath. What connected these traditions wasn't technology, but the understanding that timekeeping's ultimate purpose wasn't measurement but meaning. The real marvel emerges when we see these systems not as separate inventions, but as variations on a theme. Like musicians improvising on the same melody, cultures from the Andes to the Indus Valley all found ways to transform celestial movements into human rhythms. A farmer in Abbasid, Iraq glancing at a sundial's shadow, a concubine in Tang, China counting incense coils, a monk in Burgundy listening for the horarium bell, each was participating in humanity's grand project, turning the vast, indifferent universe into something intimate, something shared. Medieval art didn't just depict time, it danced with it, turning fleeting moments into eternal stories. Walk through the stained glass glow of a cathedral, and you'll find scenes from Genesis to Revelation unfolding in kaleidoscope colors, not as static images but as a visual timeline where past, present, and future collide. The famous Wheel of Fortune in manuscripts like the Carmina Burana showed time as a relentless cycle, kings rising and falling like the hands of a clock no one could stop. Even the humblest peasant glancing at these images understood time's dual nature, both merciless and sacred, both linear and circular. But the most revealing artworks were the labors of the months, carved into church portals or painted in prayer books. Here, time wasn't marked by numbers but by action. A farmer sowing in March, reaping in July, feasting in December. These weren't just pretty decorations, they were practical guides, teaching illiterate congregations to read the year's rhythm through vivid scenes. In the Tres Riches Huras du Duc de Berry, each month glows with gold leaf detail. February's snowbound sheep huddling near a fire, August's sunburned workers scything wheat under a sapphire sky. The message was clear. Time wasn't abstract but woven into the sweat on a plowman's brow or the frost on a winter window. What's striking is how these artworks celebrated flexibility. Unlike modern calendars gridlocked into identical squares, medieval months sprawled unevenly, some scenes bustling with activity, others steeped in rest. December might show nobles feasting while laborers slaughtered pigs, acknowledging that time moved differently for rich and poor. Even the zodiac signs sneaking into these artworks whispered a cosmic truth. Human schedules bowed to celestial ones. A fresco in Padua's Scrovegni Chapel pairs each labor with its astrological sign Taurus watching over spring planting, Virgo presiding over harvest, blending agricultural toil with starry grandeur. Then there were the memento mori masterpieces, where skeletons clutched hourglasses or worms gnawed at crumbling hourglass frames. In the dance macabre murals, popes and peasants alike waltzed with grinning death, their social hierarchies flattened by time's inevitability. These weren't morbid obsessions but visceral reminders. Life's brevity made every task sacred, whether kneading bread or copying scripture. A merchant seeing his own face in the doomed king's expression might leave Mass less obsessed with pinching pennies and more intent on savoring his daughter's laughter before the bells tolled for him. The contrast to modern timekeeping couldn't be starker. Today's digital clocks reduce hours to cold numerals, but medieval art drenched time in texture. The smell of turned earth in April, the crackle of Yule logs in December. When a Benedictine monk illuminated a parchment with lapis lazuli blue, he wasn't just decorating a page, he was freezing sunlight and shadow into something that would outlive him. These artists understood what we've forgotten, that time isn't just something to measure, but something to feel in the ache of a harvest back, the warmth of a midsummer bonfire, the hush of a winter night when the stars seemed close enough to touch. Medieval artists didn't just paint scenes, they painted time itself, weaving its passage into every brushstroke and carving. Take the Wheel of Fortune, a favorite motif in illuminated manuscripts like the Carmina Burana, where kings rise and fall on a spinning wheel turned by a blindfolded goddess. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a visual sermon on time's relentless cycle, teaching even the illiterate that power and prosperity were fleeting. The wheel's 4 positions, I shall reign, I have reigned, and I am without a kingdom, mirrored the seasons, the hours, even the arc of human life. A peasant gazing at this in a church porch didn't need a sermon on humility. The wheel's turn said it all. Then there were the books of hours, personal prayer manuals where time unfolded in gold-leafed splendor. Pages dedicated to the labors of the months showed plowmen turning soil under March's blustery skies or merchants haggling at autumn fairs. These weren't generic landscapes, they were temporal maps synchronizing human labor with celestial rhythms. The Tres Riches Hures du Dr. Berry went further, pairing each month with its zodiac sign Virgo hovering over harvesters, Capricorn watching midwinter feasts. The message was clear. Time wasn't an abstract grid, but a living force entwined with sweat, stars, and soil. Even the margins of these manuscripts whispered about time's tricks. Playful drolleries showed rabbits lugging hourglasses or monkeys winding mechanical clocks, poking fun at humanity's attempts to tame time. In the Luttrell Psalter, a grotesque creature devours its own tail, and our oberos symbolizing eternity's loop. These whimsical touches held serious weight. They reminded viewers that time could outwit even the cleverest clockmaker. The most haunting timekeepers, though, were the memento mori scenes. In the Danse Macabre frescoes, skeletons waltz with emperors and beggars alike, their bony fingers pointing to hourglasses running low. A stained glass window in Basel shows death as a gardener, uprooting lives like wilted flowers. These images weren't morbid obsessions, they were urgent reminders that time's true measure wasn't in hours but in deeds. When a merchant saw his own face reflected in a painted king crumbling to dust, the lesson stuck. Tick-tock wasn't just sound, it was a heartbeat counting down. Fast forward to today, and these medieval motifs still echo. Modern calendars still depict seasonal labors. Think farmers' almanacs with apple-picking scenes. The Wheel of Fortune survives in game shows and stock market charts. Even our phrase, "time's up," owes debt to those cathedral clocks tolling doom for procrastinators. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is in how we still personify time. Father Time with his scythe is just a sanitized version of those dancing skeletons. The medieval world knew time wasn't just numbers, it was a story, a warning, a dance, and that's why their art still speaks to us, centuries after their sundials rusted and their candle clocks burned out. Medieval timekeeping didn't just fade into history, it seeped into our language, our routines, even the way we structure our days. Take the word noon, which rolls off our tongues without a second thought. It comes from the Latin nona hora, the 9th hour of the monastic day when monks paused for prayer. Over centuries, that fixed moment drifted earlier, settling at midday, but the name stuck. Or consider clockwise. The direction our clocks spin mirrors the path of sundial shadows in the northern hemisphere, a silent nod to medieval ingenuity. Every time we say we're running out of time, we're echoing the hourglass's relentless flow, and when we clock in at work, we're invoking the tower clocks that first regimented labor. These linguistic fossils reveal how deeply medieval timekeeping shaped modern life. The chime of a church bell at midday, that's a direct descendant of the canonical hours, ringing across centuries to tell us to pause for lunch. The concept of a night shift traces back to candlelit vigils and watchmen's lanterns marking the dark hours. Even our obsession with punctuality, the idea that time is money, grew from the medieval marketplace, where bells dictated when goods could be sold and debts repaid. The past isn't just preserved in museums, it lives in the rhythm of our daily speech. What's truly remarkable is how these systems balanced rigidity and flexibility. Medieval people understood that time could be both sacred and adaptable, measured by bells yet molded by seasons, enforced by law yet celebrated in festivals. They left us a legacy not just of gears and gadgets, but of a richer, more textured relationship with time. So the next time you glance at your phone for the hour, remember, you're part of a story that began with shadow and flame, with monks chanting in cloisters and farmers reading the sky. The medieval world may seem distant, but its heartbeat still ticks beneath ours, quiet and insistent, like a candle burning down in the dark.